All right, so for this first part, we want to find f of g of x, and you already have it, but I'm just going to walk you through it again. So we start off with f of x because the f comes first. And what we're doing is we're taking that x out and we're substituting in our second function. And the second function we're substituting in is the square root of x minus 5. So once we simplify this problem, we have f of the square root of x minus 5 is equal to x minus 5. So when you're trying to figure out the domain, you have to pay attention to two things. You have to pay attention to the domain of what you plugged in, and you have to pay attention to the domain of our final answer. So the domain, what we plugged in, was the square root of x minus 5. So the domain of any radical equation, you have to take whatever is under the radical sign, set that greater than or equal to 0, so x has to be greater than or equal to 5. Then you have to pay attention to the domain of our result, which is x minus 5. And since that's linear, your domain is from negative infinity to positive infinity. So the first function you plugged in says I have to have 5 or higher, and the final answer says I can use any number. Well, you need the domain that's going to work for both of those functions. So what works for both is if we're using numbers 5 and higher. Because you can't use 4 here, even though it says in x minus 5 you can. So you have to use what works for what you plug in and your final result. So for your second part, g of x, g comes first, so that's the first function we write down. And we're taking x out, and you're substituting in the other function in its place. So we're plugging in, once again, the square root of x minus 5. So our result of g of f is the square root of x minus 5, that quantity minus 5. So to find our domain, once again, we have to pay attention to the domain of what we plugged in here. So that domain says that x has to be greater than or equal to 5, and you have to pay attention to the domain of your final answer. And once again, whenever you have radicals, you have to take everything that's under the radical sign. And when I say radical sign, I'm talking about the big one here. Everything that's under this radical sign, set it greater than or equal to 0 and solve. So the square root of x minus 5 has to be greater than or equal to 5. We have to square both sides. So we have x minus 5 has to be greater than or equal to 25. And x has to be greater than or equal to 30. So we have two things we need to compare. This says I need numbers 5 and higher. This says I need numbers 30 and higher. So you can only use what works for both. And you may want to draw a number line if it helps you to see it better. So your first domain says I want 5 and higher. Your second domain says I want 30 and higher. So what's going to work for both is where the two lines overlap. And that's from 30 to positive infinity. That's your domain of the entire function. Those values will work for both of these all the time.
Made with Doodlecast Pro.